On January 27th of this year, the Biden administration put out a wide-ranging executive order on tackling climate change. Tucked in that executive order was a line directing Secretaries of Agriculture, Interior, and Commerce to develop a plan to conserve at least 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. This plan is commonly referred to as the 30 by 30. To reach the Biden administration's goal of 30% of the land in conservation by 2030, the federal government will have significant work ahead of them to accomplish that. This is what 30% means. 30% of the land would mean that we'll need 440 million additional acres in permanent conservation. To put 440 million acres of land into perspective, it's the equivalent of taking the state of Iowa and putting all of Iowa's land into permanent conservation. But that's still not enough to get to 440 million acres. You'd repeat that 11 more times to reach the Biden administration's goals of 30% of the land in conservation by 2030. This is not really an attempt at conservation. It's an attempt at confiscation, even though the confiscation would be rewarded presumably by annual payments from the federal government. Between the 30 by 30 land grab and the waters of the U.S. rewrite, it's clear that this administration simply does not understand rural America. If they did understand, then they would realize that farmers are the first and best conservationists because it's good for their pocketbook and good for the environment. If the United States decides to go forward with the 30 by 30 plan, we already know what will happen. This rhetoric empowers our nation's corn and soybean competitors to increase their output. Now, Brazil is the best example of our corn and soybean competitors. So let's look at Brazil. This week, the Brazilian House of Representatives advanced a bill that their president, President Bolsonaro, supports that allows the squatters on public lands in the Amazon rainforest to more easily receive deeds to their property. Now, there's nothing wrong with deeds to property, but what this is going to do is allow squatters to burn the forest to plant corn and soybeans. Now, let me tell you how significant this burning is. And this was a few years ago I read this, but I read from the astronauts in our space station circling the globe. They said there was two significant things that stand out on the Earth's surface when you look down. Number one is the Great Wall of China, and number two is the smoke coming from the burning of the rainforest. Now, Brazil has already plowed under more than half of Cerrado, which is tropical savanna. The Cerrado is a vital storehouse for carbon dioxide that has been disappearing at the rates faster than even the Amazon rainforest. If we tie the hands of American farmers, our competitors like the ones in Brazil will continue to meet the needs of a growing, hungry world. And by 2050, the world population will grow to 9 billion people, and you're going to have to feed them. And I don't think the United States should cede our leadership in production agriculture to other countries that already have a poor environmental standards. So what you're saying is, in this Serrano, where the carbon is already sequestered for millennia, that somehow we ought to have a policy here to store more carbon by more conservation, but let them plow up more in Brazil. The 5-year Farm Bill already does a great job of encouraging farmers and landowners to preserve fragile lands, enhancing the environmental benefits for all Americans. These Farm Bill provisions are referred to as working lands programs. Programs like the Environmental Quality Incentive Program that goes by the acronym EQIP, or the Conservation Stewardship Program we call CSP. These programs provide incentives to help producers adopt management practices on their ground that allows the land to stay in production while improving environmental outcomes. If the Biden administration focuses on these long-time conservation programs, my speech today would be praising those efforts. But instead, this administration has proposals that take productive farmland out of production, placing the U.S. at a competitive advantage. And we've learned from the Conservation Reserve Program, CRP as we call it in agriculture. The CRP program we've had around for decades. About 24 million acres is in CRP now. But we learned a lesson from the early days of the CRP that you take too much land out of production in one local area and it hurts the small business people that either serve farmers after their products leave the farm or serve the farmers with input into agriculture. So later on, we had to put a requirement that no more one county, 25% of one county, can be put into the CRP. And even doing that, we have counties in southern Iowa that have 25% of their land in CRP. And we know even there, that limit of 25%, still we have lost a lot of small business people that work with farmers, and you ruin the small communities of states that have that problem. So I would be praising these efforts if this is what the administration was satisfied with, but instead they have these proposals to take productive farmland out of production, putting our competitors at a financial disadvantage. These ideas also make it harder for new and beginning farmers to compete on rental rates and gain access to land. Another lesson we learned in the years 13, 14, and 15, we changed it in the 2018 Farm Bill, but what we learned in 13, 14, and 18, when the government's paying more for farmers to take their land out of production than is the going rate for cash rent in those areas, when the government becomes an unfair competitor, pay more, then the farmer landlords put their land in the CRP, and then those farmers that were farming that land can't farm it anymore because they can't afford to compete with what the government's paying. Now there's a limit that cash rent from the government can't be more than 80% of the average cash rent in a particular county, so we kind of overcome that problem. But if you're going to have to pay farmers now to put 30% of the land in production, you're going to lose a lot of small farmers that are cash renters. And we shouldn't be having the government be an unfair competitor against the farmers that pay cash rent. So these farmers understand how conservation and sustainable agriculture affects productivity and generational prosperity. It's important for us to leave the land better than we found it for our children and grandchildren. So far, the Biden administration has said their 30 by 30 plan focuses on voluntary measures. Well, farmers can make a choice to do it or not. But to get to 440 million additional acres in conservation, you would be foolish to think that voluntary measures are going to get to the goal that this administration wants. Instead of focusing on taking more land out of production agriculture, let's work on a strategy that allows farmers to continue to farm their land while improving environmental outcomes. I yield.